The podcast today is sponsored by Boostability, the leader in search engine optimization for small business. If you have a website that needs to be seen, your website needs to rank high when people search for what your website does or what you sell. To find out how your website is performing right now and to get some ideas to help it perform better, go to myfreewebsitescore.com. It's myfreewebsitescore.com from Boostability. Today on Something You Should Know, the law of averages. It's actually not much of a law. It doesn't work the way you think, and if you're a gambler, it's probably cost you a ton of money. Plus, stress. It's a big problem, and it takes a real toll.
It causes negative thinking, weight gain, inflammation, hair loss, breaks down muscle tissue, causes flabbiness, depression, anxiety, and memory loss.
And if you're feeling stressed out, you can stop wondering why.
We work too hard, we sleep too little, we love with half a heart, and then we wonder why we're stressed and unhappy.
Plus, do you ever wish you had more photographs of relatives and friends who are now gone? Why that is, and what you can do now to stop it. All that today on Something You Should Know.
Something you should know. Fascinating intel, the world's top experts, and practical advice you can use in your life today.
The Something You Should Know podcast
with Mike Carruthers.
Hi, welcome to the podcast. I haven't mentioned this much before, but this podcast, Something You Should Know, is actually based on a radio show that I've been doing for couple decades now, called Something You Should Know. It's a daily program that's heard on radio stations around the country. But the difference between the radio show and the podcast is the radio show itself is only 90 seconds long. It's a minute and a half long because that's what radio stations want. So to be able to do this podcast and to go into more depth and have longer conversations with really fascinating people is really exciting for me, and I certainly hope you're enjoying it. Among the topics we're going to discuss today, the law of averages. And I'm sure you have a sense of what the law of averages is, this idea that everything has a way of evening out. But the law of averages is probably not what you think. In fact, it's not much of a law at all, and it's cost gamblers millions of dollars over the years. We'll discuss that, plus the topic of stress. And yes, I'm sure you know what stress is. Everyone has felt it, and we all know it's bad for us on some level. But when you hear my guest today, you will have a new appreciation for stress and an understanding that so much of the stress in our lives is self-imposed. It isn't real. It feels real, and it certainly takes its toll on our bodies and our brains. But a lot of the stress that we have, we create ourselves. And my guest will tell us how to stop that. And also today, have you ever wished that you had more photographs of people who are no longer in your life? Perhaps you've lost them to death, or they've moved away, or they've just somehow moved out of your life, and you find you really don't have that many pictures of them. Well, it turns out to be a very common problem. I know for myself that there are relatives I remember when I was a kid who have since gone, and I wish I had more photographs of them because I remember them, but the memories are a little dim, and it would be great to be able to see pictures of them, and there just aren't that many of them around. Well, one psychologist has a remarkably simple solution to this problem if you've ever felt the same way, that you wished you had more pictures of people who are now gone. Now, if you've been listening to the podcast, perhaps you already know that every week we are giving away a $100 Amazon gift card to one listener who leaves a rating and review on iTunes. All you have to do to be eligible to win is go to iTunes and leave a rating and review of this podcast, and then once it's published, take a screenshot of the rating and review and send it to me at info@somethingyoushouldknow.net. And then you're automatically eligible to win this week's $100 gift card from Amazon.com. Today we start with the law of averages. You've heard that phrase, the law of averages, but it turns out people are very confused by this law. First of all, it's not a law. It is actually just a lay term that says that things should even out. For example, if you flip a coin 100 times, the law of averages says you should get 50 heads and 50 tails. But actually, mathematically, there's only an 8% chance that that will happen. Gamblers sometimes think that if the roulette wheel comes up red 3 times in a row, that the law of averages says that it is more likely to land on black on the 4th spin. But it's not. 4 spins is not a big enough sample for things to even out. This is something called the gambler's fallacy, and it has ended up costing gamblers millions and millions of dollars. Now, if you spin a wheel 1,000,000 times or flip a coin 1,000,000 times, then something called the law of large numbers takes effect. And then things do even out. They have to. The law of large numbers is a real mathematical principle. But any one flip or any one spin is not influenced by what happened before unless the game is rigged. How many times have you heard that stress is terrible for us? It's killing us, that we need to eliminate the stress from our lives. And there are zillion different books and authors and programs on stress and stress reduction. But what's interesting to me about stress is that stress is something we impose upon ourselves for the most part. And so it's pretty much up to us to get rid of it. Now, my guest is Dr. Arthur Ciaramicolli. He is a licensed clinical psychologist and chief medical officer of soundminds.org. And he's written a couple of great books that I've read before. One is The Power of Empathy, and the other is Performance Addiction. And he has a new book out called The Stress Solution. And Arthur knows an awful lot about stress, and I think you'll have a different perspective and a different understanding of how to deal with stress in your life when you hear what he has to say. Welcome, Arthur.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
So define stress for me. What is it exactly?
Well, stress really is produced mostly by misperception. When we're perceiving inaccurately, we produce stress, and we produce the stress hormone cortisol. And when we do that, we narrow our ability to think in a more expansive way, and it also reduces our capacity for empathy, meaning that when our thinking becomes narrow, and that is a result of the stress hormone cortisol, we can't see things very clearly, and we tend to perceive in distorted ways.
And so when you say it's distorted, but if I'm in a stressful situation, what I'm seeing is it's what I'm seeing.
Well, you may be, but the issue is, and here's where empathy comes in, Mike, is empathy is really about perceiving beyond the surface. So if you're in a stressful situation, the question is, can you slow down your perceptions enough and slow down your reactions enough to see the truth so that you can make very good decisions rather than making quick, impulsive decisions based on narrow thinking?
But that stress reaction that we all get when we're in that situation must be serving a purpose, and we've all heard about, the tiger chasing the caveman kind of thing, that it serves that purpose of protecting yourself. Has it outlived its purpose?
Well, when we needed to be protected against tigers, yes, we had that flight system activated through our brains, and that makes us want to run away and produce these stress hormones that allow us to do that, make our heart beat faster and get more energy and sugar into our muscles. But most of the time today in our current world, in our civilized world, we're producing stress when we're sitting in a chair not going anywhere. If your boss walks by you and he has a frown and you think that it's because he's angry and upset with you, you produce the stress response. Then later you found out that he has a migraine this morning and he wasn't even thinking about you, but you overreacted because your perceptions were distorted. And again, that's where empathy comes in, because empathy allows us to slow down our perception, find out where our biases are, and that's where cognitive behavioral therapy helps, because it focuses on the distortion we make in thinking, like generalizing or mind reading. And in that case, the person would be mind reading. They'd say, oh, gee, he's frowning. He must be upset with me, when in fact the poor guy has a migraine. He's not even thinking of the teacher sitting in the classroom.
So this way of thinking where we overthink and we think things that aren't true and all of that, it would be great to be able to sit back and say, well, now calm down. This is just me in my stressful moment here. But in the moment, it's extremely hard to do.
It's very hard to do, Mike, but if we practice the development of empathy, we more and more learn where our biases are, how they come from the past. And when we realize which kind of cognitive distortions we tend to use repeatedly, we can filter them out over time. And when we're in a stressful situation, we tend not to use them. The more we become disciplined about trying as much as we can to perceive accurately. We kind of learn our old records, our old stories, and when we get a sense of repeating those old ways of perceiving, those ways of perceiving that we know are not based on the truth, we can tend to discard them much quicker than in the past.
And so how do you start this process? What do you do first to kind of get a sense of what you're talking about?
Well, using empathy. Empathy actually produces the connecting hormone oxytocin. It's called the love hormone or connecting hormone. It relaxes our physiology. It allows our brain to think more expansively. And when we use empathy in interactions, we are more able to see the whole of a situation. We're more able to perceive comprehensively. So it is a lot about empathy training, teaching ourselves to not jump to conclusions, to not impulsively react, to try to slow down enough to gain the facts. When we sense in our body that we're starting to feel our blood pressure elevate, we have to teach ourselves to slow down, because once we produce those stress hormones, our thinking is becoming very narrow and empathy goes out the window. So this is a lot about teaching ourselves to be more empathic and realizing that when we do that and we produce this oxytocin, the compassion and connecting hormone, it relaxes us and allows us to perceive much more accurately and comprehensively.
So can you give me an idea of how, maybe in an example, that would work?
Well, for instance, if you're in an interaction with a spouse or a significant other and you come home from work and you walk in and, maybe your wife has had a bad day with raising 3 young children, and she immediately looks up and is washing the dishes and doesn't say hi and come over and kiss you, and you react immediately by saying, I can't believe I worked all day and you're treating me this way, and together you're off to the races. Rather than walking into the house assuming that she's been alone with 3 young kids all day, she's probably going to be very stressed and she may not greet me in the most loving way, so I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt and try to slow down my reaction and ask her, gee, how are things going? How can I help? Maybe start picking up some of the kids' toys. And by that, you're not reacting quickly. You're not being so overly sensitive to the interaction. And when we react empathically, when we give our spouse, a significant other, or friends or colleagues a break because they're a little off in that moment, they tend to be more empathic with us, and we have much more likelihood of having an empathic interchange rather than starting an argument.
Well, what about stress that is self-created, self-imposed? There's no other person to have empathy for. It's all in our head.
Yes, I mean, I talk I have a chapter in the book on self-talk because, we learn how to talk to ourselves very early in life. If you've been called names or you've been called stupid or told that you're unattractive, or if you've been bullied, as a young child, you tend to internalize those views of yourself, and then you don't even realize that that's the way you talk to yourself. And that's the way you produce stress internally without even being in an interaction with other people, because you're repeating interactions of the past. And early in life, those interactions are very influential, and they can have a dramatic effect on how you talk to yourself. So what's the work? The work is trying, again, to engage in interactions where you take in rational feedback from other people to try to get a better sense of who you are, because, we all grow up with biases. We all grow up with inaccuracies about ourselves. In many ways, it's sort of like when we grow up, we were looking in a circus mirror and we can't see ourselves all that accurately unless we get very clear feedback from others. And if you didn't get very clear feedback from others growing up, you need to get it as an adult. You need to engage with other rational people. That's, when I do group therapy sessions, for instance, that's what we do. We spend time on giving each other feedback on how people interact with each other so that you can rewrite the old story and create a new story. It's sort of turning a fiction book into a nonfiction book. And you have to be open to feedback from other people to change that negative self-talk, especially rational people will be truthful and tactful with you.
I want to ask you about stress and worry, because those two things seem to go hand in hand. Before I do, though, I want to mention our sponsor today for the podcast, and that is Boostability. If you have a website that needs to get seen by people, well, you need to practice something called search engine optimization. And basically what that means is when people search for what your website does or sells, that your website comes up near the top of those search engine results. If it does, that means you are practicing good search engine optimization. And that's just what Boostability does. They help small business websites rank high in search engine results. Now, I know a lot of people think that in order to do search engine optimization, you just need to make sure you do the right tags and metadata, and there are plugins you can add to your website that improve your search engine optimization and all that. But it's actually much more than that. Search engine optimization is an ongoing process, and Boostability does it extremely well for their clients. And they have thousands and thousands of clients all over the world. What I'd like you to do is go to this website, myfreewebsitescore.com, and then fill in some information, and you will immediately get back your free website score and analysis that will tell you exactly how well your website performs now and some ideas on what you can do to make it perform better. It's all free and it's all instantaneous. You just go to myfreewebsitescore.com. That's myfreewebsitescore.com from Boostability. My guest is Dr. Arthur Ciaramicolli. He is author of the book, The Stress Solution. And I wanted to ask you about worry and stress. Are they the same thing? Does one cause the other? How exactly are they related?
Well, worry and stress and anxiety are all in the same circle because worry usually, not always, but usually is based on projected fears from the past and, again, misperceiving. We worry about tomorrow when most of us cannot accept the fact that we can't predict tomorrow. You know, Americans right now, half of Americans say they are awake at night due to stress, anticipating stress for the next day. 75% of Americans say they experience stress on a daily basis, and it is based on worry about what's going to happen. When you are an anxious person and you have negative self-talk, the likelihood that you're anticipating negativity in the future is very, very high. And this whole approach, this empathic cognitive behavioral therapy approach, I developed over many years to help people slow down and recognize that old negative bias thinking and get help in correcting it through positive interactions with other people.
That's pretty amazing that many people claim to be up at night worrying about tomorrow.
It is amazing because the stress rates in our country have really increased dramatically. I mean, and it goes along with several other things that have happened in our country. I mean, the empathy rates have diminished. The amount of Americans trusting each other has diminished. 20 years ago, Americans said they had 5 to 7 close friends. Today, it's 2 to 3 close friends. So our empathy for each other has been reduced. Prejudice has been increased. And that's another point that I try to accent in this book as I wrote a section on prejudice, that prejudice basically is biased thinking, and it produces a great amount of stress. I mean, prejudice, if you have many prejudices, you're experiencing stress all the time because you're kind of walking through a minefield in life. If you feel uncomfortable with African Americans or Italian Americans or Irish Americans or Muslims, you have multiple ways of experiencing stress on an ongoing basis. So the stress hormone cortisol is living within you on a regular basis, which causes negative thinking, weight gain, inflammation, hair loss, breaks down muscle tissue, causes flabbiness, depression, anxiety, and memory loss.
Well, who could remember that if they're all stressed out?
Right.
Wow. And what is it about, it does seem that people are so less empathetic and sympathetic to their fellow man today. Is that just a perception, or do you think that's true? I mean, road rage and all this, is this just, what's going on?
Well, I think it's part of our fast-paced society, Mike. I mean, we are at a point where we work too hard, we sleep too little, we love with half a heart, and then we wonder why we're stressed and unhappy. And the empathy rates, there's a number of studies that have done every year where they test college seniors going into the workplace and what characteristics do they rate most importantly. Empathy used to be in the top 5, top 3 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Now it's below 10, 12, 13. the first thing that people are emphasizing is making money. So we have begun to put a tremendous emphasis on status and image and prestige, and far less emphasis on character and integrity. And it certainly is pervasive in our society currently.
You know, it's amazing from what I've read and heard and talked to people about this who are experts on the topic that all this does, I mean, all this stress and getting all pissed off at everybody, all it does is hurt you. I mean, it doesn't do anything. You get mad and brood about somebody who cut you off on the highway. They're not home worrying about you.
Yes. And you're hurting yourself when you misperceive. Even people who maintain that they believe in their prejudices, once they realize that they're actually hurting their health and their physiology, they start to take heed a bit. And yes, the way we think, the way we perceive is how we produce stress for the most part, and we're damaging our entire physiology, our heart, our brain, our immune system, on and on. The stress hormone cortisol is incredibly damaging if it's experienced on a regular basis.
People will often say, though, that, I'm a worrier. That's what I do, or that's part of my personality. Yes? No?
No, I mean, if you examine little children, they're not worried. 1-year-olds are not worried. 2-year-olds are having a great time. We learn to worry by the environment we grow up in, and anything that's learned can be unlearned. So no one is genetically programmed to worry. That is not true. It's never been proven. It is a learned characteristic. And again, I'm not saying that it can be unlearned very easily, but anything that's learned, anything in your life that you have learned can be unlearned if you focus on it with diligence and commitment.
But that surprises me because I've seen plenty of kids in families where, one kid is a worrier, grows up to be a worrier, and the other kid didn't, and they grew up in the same house.
Well, they grew up in the same house, but we all know from having siblings, siblings are treated differently. And we're born with a bit different temperaments, but if you were born when your father had a great job and was very happy in his life, and I was born when he was laid off and couldn't find employment for 4 years, or I was the youngest and you were the oldest of 5, and I go through the divorce of our parents, but you were off in college when they got divorced, your experience may be very different than mine because parents are different at different ages, and parents interact with males differently than they interact with females. So there's a lot of variables in a family that we have to account for that can produce worry and anxiety.
As someone who has certainly experienced that, waking up at 4 a.m. and worrying, to not do that seems almost impossible.
I think when you've been accustomed to it for a long time, and these habits we've established neural pathways in our brain where they're just easily continued, and it feels like automatic thinking. But you have to kind of step outside yourself and in a way use empathy toward yourself. It's almost like you're observing yourself. You have to learn those old records that you repeat over and over again. For instance, some people wake up at the same time every night, 2:10, 3:10 in the morning, and they'll tell you exactly what they're going to be thinking. And I say, practice the night before not thinking that, knowing that that's your old record. We're trying to change old conditioned ways of thinking by almost being prepared for them. So instead of waking up every morning at 3 o'clock saying the same thing, oh my God, I got to go to work, it's not going to be good, my boss doesn't like me, on and on and on, you counter that immediately. And you don't fall into it. And that again is what happens when you know your old records. It's like dropping a needle on an album. Instead of playing all 22 records, you pick the needle up. You don't let it go on and on and on. This is what I always do. And instead of just letting it roll on and letting your thoughts have a life of its own, you begin to be more thoughtful and aware of what you're thinking so that you can intercede in those old conditioned ways of perceiving.
So when I've had those times in life, and I imagine everybody does, where you're up at night worrying and catastrophizing and everything, one of the fascinating things I've found, maybe it's just me, but if I just get up and really wake up and not be in that kind of half-asleep fog, then things seem better. Things seem more real, as opposed to when I'm lying there ruminating, then things seem worse.
Well, when we're sleeping, And when we first wake up, our temperature is the lowest it is all day. So, and we've been fasting, so we don't have the nutrients to make the brain chemicals we need to think accurately. That's why people, when I say, when you wake up in the morning, get up and start moving. I'm a fan of teaching people to exercise first thing in the morning, for instance, because you find that you start to produce more energy, you produce more calming neurochemicals, you get some food that produces the nutrients that your brain can turn into the right neurochemicals to think accurately. So when we're just sitting there in a kind of dull state, yes, your thoughts can easily go into a negative place. It's like why depressed people, the worst time for them is when they wake up in the morning. But again, when you're waking up in the middle of the night, if you're just going to lay there and reminisce about all the negative things that have happened in your life, it is better to get up, maybe have a little something to eat and go back to bed. But you just don't want to make it a habit, though, because then your brain gets conditioned to waking up at the same time over and over again, and you want to lose an hour of sleep every night.
Why do people who do this and then things usually eventually work out? Unless you're diagnosed with some terminal illness. What was it Mark Twain said, that most of the things we worry about never come true? Why don't we learn from that?
Well, because it's emotional learning, Mike. It's not something that we can rationally easily change. It's when we're conditioned early in life to think a certain way. It's like dropping that needle on a record. It starts immediately unless we intercede. And we have to keep learning how and discipline ourselves to break up that thought pattern. And that's we do that by always asking ourselves, what is the truth? What is the truth? And empathy is focused on truth finding. And that's why it's such an important capacity. And you can continue to think in negative ways your entire life without ever realizing it because you're not very aware of what's happening. You're just allowing that old story to dominate your life.
But what if the truth really is horrible?
Well, the likelihood of that being so is very low. I mean, how many human beings do you know that are horrible human beings with no talent, no abilities, and are utterly ugly? So most of the fears that people have don't tend to be fact-based. We all have imperfections, and if there is something that we need to improve on, like you tend to react too quickly, you tend to be too angry, again, these are all learned patterns that can be unlearned. So you have to acknowledge your misgivings and have to acknowledge your imperfections, but the likelihood that you're going to end up in such a dismal place that you're a horrible human being, I just haven't met anyone in my travels that's like that.
Yeah. Well, you probably wouldn't, because they're hiding in a cave somewhere, I suspect.
Yeah.
But if 75% of people are doing this, it almost has become the new normal.
75% of my practice right now are not people who are mentally ill, but they're highly stressed. They're good people. They are oftentimes educated people. They're loving people, but their lives are in such a fast pace. They're living such a fast-paced life. Everything is so hectic. And as I said, they work long hours. They don't sleep enough. They don't exercise enough. Their health habits in terms of eating and exercise tend to be poor. We live our lives according to our mood, and if we're stressed and producing cortisol with consistency, we are not going to choose the best ways of taking care of ourselves. And so I do believe it has become epidemic in our society.
Well, I don't know anybody that couldn't use a little stress management in their life, so I appreciate the insight and the advice. Thanks, Arthur.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you having me again.
Dr. Arthur Ciaramicolli has been my guest. He is the author of The Stress Solution, and there's a link to his book and to his website on the show notes page for this podcast at somethingyoushouldknow.net. Lastly today, it turns out to be a surprisingly common experience that people wish they had pictures of relatives who have passed on or friends or even just moved away and they're no longer in your life. And we wish we had more photographs of them, but we don't. So why don't we? Well, psychologist Nancy Darling, writing in Psychology Today, says one of the reasons is that there's just a lot of people who don't like to have their picture taken. So when the camera comes out, they disappear or they turn their head. No, my hair's a mess. I don't want to get my picture taken. And so they avoid the camera, and consequently, there aren't many pictures of them. Or the other thing is that so often we take pictures of people standing at the base of the Eiffel Tower, and we're so far back you can't tell who's in the picture. So even though we have pictures of them, they're not very good pictures of them. And so Dr. Darling's advice is, and what she's doing in her house, is just changing the policy. From now on, you come into her house, she just takes pictures of everybody. Clear, close-up photos of people. Because it's people who we want to remember after they're gone, and photographs and even videos are a great way to remember them. So no more, oh, don't take my picture, my hair's a mess. People come into the house, they get their picture taken. Because there will come a time when you will thank yourself for taking all those people pictures. That's our podcast today. A reminder that if you would like a chance to win a $100 Amazon gift card, we're giving away one every week to somebody who leaves a rating and review on iTunes and then emails me a screenshot of that rating and review to info@somethingyoushouldknow.net. Our sponsor today is Boostability. If you have a small business website that you need people to find, you need good search engine optimization, and that's just what Boostability does. To take advantage of their free offer, just go to myfreewebsitescore.com, fill in some information, and you will instantly get back a free report on how well your website performs right